Welcome, everyone. My name is Abe Eshkenazi, currently the CEO for the Association for Supply Chain Management. Pleased today to have Measuring the Circular Economy Transition, part of our Circular Economy series. With us today is James George, Business Engagement Lead for the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. A little bit about James. As a key stalwart of the Ellen MacArthur Foundation business team, James is responsible for engaging with the Foundation's network to ensure that the impact, scale, and ambition of those organizations help support the Foundation's vision for the future. By understanding how an organization's strategy on circular economy aligns with the Foundation and its partners, James is able to work closely with other project leads and provide context to the business community on how they can engage effectively with the Foundation. Welcome, James.
Hi, thanks very much for having me. And that's quite the introduction. I think if I reflect on the fact that we've just kind of got to the end of this year, I wonder if I've actually done that in its entirety through the course of this year, through the description. Maybe it needs a bit of an update, but no, great to be here.
And I would imagine we all are going to do a reset some point in the future here, trying to understand where we've come from and where we're going, but really pleased to have you today. So let's get into this. Let's kick it off, James. Circulytics, give me a sense of why Ellen MacArthur developed this and what was the focus?
Yeah, Circulytics, which we launched back in January of this year, 2020. And it is our circular economy metric tool to help organizations try and understand where they sit on that journey. Where are they? And I guess the reason we brought this to bear was because as we look at the mission to accelerate a transition to a circular economy, we all understand that measurement is a critical tool in any kind of journey and to support any strategic change. It helps us highlight to the companies that we work with and the organizations we work with where they need to focus efforts, improve their efforts around related sectors, and supports them identifying and building on successes. So for us, this was very much about helping those organizations we're working with by giving them some quantitative information about where they sit on their journey. So looking at material flows, looking at the strategy they have in place, looking at the folks they have in their organizations and their job titles, and trying to understand holistically where that business or where that organization sits on that journey, on that scale, and then help them identify how they push forward from that point. So we don't know what good looks like unless we can measure it. Mm-hmm. And we don't know if we're progressing towards good unless we know where we're starting from. So for us, that's where the kind of crux came from.
Mm-hmm. Really ambitious, because as we've seen a lot of different definitions on sustainability and circular economies. Give me a sense of how does this work across industries, and how does this benefit organizations to be able to have common language, common metrics for the circular economy reports?
And I think that's really important as well, Abe. How do you compare apples with apples, not just apples with pears? How do you make sure that there is a commonality? And there are, this isn't the first metric tool out there for efficiency or for looking at how a business is operating under certain guises. But what we wanted to create was a baseline that people could come back to continuously. Now, it's been running since January this year. So we're now in November, almost December. So we've been going for about just shy of 12 months on this now. And we've just got to version 2, which launched 2 weeks ago. But this for us is a long-term endeavor, because what we're asking organizations to do is cycle through this process every 12 months. And by doing that over time, a number of things happen. Firstly, they get to see where their efforts are returning results. It allows organizations to change direction. And 12 months is the recommendation, but they can do it more, a shorter cadence than that, or they can do longer, but we recommend 12 months. And the second point as well is as more and more organizations adopt the methodology and submit the information and the KPIs in order to get that kind of qualitative return and from the stuff they put in, we can start to anonymize that and create industrial standards. So the aim then, Abe, is hopefully in 3, maybe 5 years' time, what we have is a industrial baseline across a majority of industries, a majority of geographies, And then that is when this starts to really, really deliver huge amounts of value for companies, because it's not then about us creating a league table. It's about saying, here's an industry standard and here's where you sit on that industry standard. So you know whether you are ahead or behind of your competitors or your, the members in your value chain. But more importantly, you know that you can attribute effort and time and resource to those areas where you need to lift that average up.
It's really interesting as you're pointing out the reporting out in terms of identifying the key metrics for organizations, not only internally, but externally. As we know, organizations often cherry pick those metrics that are, favorable to them, and oftentimes sort of downgrade or not report on some of their challenges in meeting some of their, the key metrics on sustainability and circular economy. So give me a sense, what does a company gain from it internally? What do they gain from it externally in assessing and reporting out like this?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And the reason why I think it's a great question is some of it's quite subjective as well. Like some companies will take this process and they'll hold it very much internally, and they won't want to talk about it externally, either because maybe they haven't fared as well as they have, or they don't want to risk exposing themselves compared to some of their competitors. But the most interesting thing for me through this, and anecdotally through talking to some of our companies that have done it, and I remember very specifically DS Smith, one of our strategic partners, they went through the process, and what they were most amazed by is where it identified areas that they hadn't thought about. So they had a circular economy strategy, they had a direction of travel, but they hadn't considered some of the returns that they got through the circular economy tool. So it allowed them to go, well, we've got 80% of what we want to do in a strategy, but we've missed off this whole other wedge of activity that we need to consider. So sometimes it's not just there to tell you how you're doing in the areas that you think are most important, but also it's to identify what are the bits that you're not thinking about? What is the stuff that you don't know that you need to know? When we look at this holistically across an organization. And I think that's quite powerful, but it takes a sense of courage and honesty for a company then to come forward and say, we didn't get all the stuff we thought we were going to get. And actually that's what we recognize. And now that allows us to plan differently as we move into the next financial year. There's another really important part here as well, Abe, around companies are obviously very, very nervous about talking about what happens internally and airing their dirty washing in public. And for us, as we launched this in the first year, it's been about generating interest and getting organizations to get stuck into the platform and submit their data. But it's also been about trying to help them understand where this can take them in the future. So what does this mean in terms of what they understand about their own score that they get, where that sits in the industry, but actually the data they're submitting, what does that mean in reality? Now, we're not going to create league tables, as I mentioned. We're not going to say who's who is doing well this year and next year. And we don't expect the companies to do so either. But it's at their own discretion whether they do want to. Mm-hmm. And so there's also this nice unintended consequence that if companies start talking about this publicly, irrespective of what their score is, and other companies who might be competitors or sit in a similar industry don't, then actually that generates almost an unintended kind of, well, they're talking about it, so they must be proud. So if you're not, then maybe there's something that you need to work on. And it gamifies and creates a kind of competitiveness indirectly through them being part of Circulytics.
Yeah, I mean, omission of a report would indicate, wait a second, why am I not getting this information from you if I'm getting it from, a competitor or a different organization? What is it about your company? And you may in fact be a better organization, but the consumer, the investor, the general public has very little insight into it. Give me a sense, do people really understand circularity outside of the business community yet? Or are we still in a sort of a definition phase for it right now in terms of meaning?
Yeah, do you know what, Abe? If you'd asked me that 6 months ago, I would have said we're definitely still in the understanding and the definition. But I think as of today, whether that has been exclusively through the acceleration of thought given COVID in the last 6 to 9 months, whether that's just been because we've reached a tipping point in the discussion around sustainability. I mean, someone described it to me a few months back. This discussion has never moved as quickly as it did in 2019, and it will never move that slowly again. But for me, this is very much becoming much more mainstream as a concept, as an idea. And we're moving from understanding why to now understanding how. And that's going to be the feature of the next 6 to 12 months. Certainly one of the big features for 2021, as far as I'm concerned. Now organizations understand why the circular economy is important in terms of either long-term resilience, securing supply chains, mitigating rare earth metal and commodity rises through product reclamation. Now is about how do we do that? We've got the concept, now how do we put it into practice and how do we start to deliver that?
So let's dig into it a little bit. Give me a sense of cost, time commitment, focus for a company to participate. Oftentimes it's that initial, getting it started. That's the biggest barrier to a lot of organizations saying, okay, it's not a function of understanding what it is. It's just getting it started. What does it take for a company to get that commitment internally?
Yeah, it's another really great question. And I think it is fundamentally, once they've got past that stage of, right, we need to do something differently, and we realize we need to do something differently, is the second point is always got to be, what do you want to achieve? What does good look like? Mm-hmm. Where do you want to be in 12, 18, 24 months, 5 years time? And almost reverse engineer that problem. Because unless you know the direction you're going in, it doesn't matter how much effort you put in, because you might not be heading in the right direction. Again, this is where, potentially Circulytics supports that. You know where you are today, and if you know where you want to get to, you can then put that effort in. I think when it looks specifically about what is the cost benefit analysis, what is the time, what is the investment, there are a number of things to consider. There's no definitive answer is the short way, which is not my way of getting off the hook for your question. But I think, again, comparing cross-industry, sympathetic industries, down a value chain, same product in different geographies, different infrastructure, there are always different considerations. That's the beauty and the complexity of system-level engagement and system-level change. So once you've understood what good looks like and why it's important, it's then trying to get down to what can we do straight away. And there's a lovely analogy from IDEO, and they use this idea of bridges and beacons. Sometimes you need a beacon. You need a project that you can pull together relatively quickly. It might not be 100% perfect, but it creates that light, that flame to draw the moths towards it. It creates the inspiration of what is possible. And then sometimes you need something that's baked into the core of your organization, the very foundations of what you do. It might not tell a great story. It might not be particularly sexy, but actually what it does is fundamentally set you up for the next stage of that journey. And that could be unpicking some of the bias in your manufacturing process. It could be looking at new material selection, understanding what a more localized supply chain might look like from a distributed one across borders, and taking a zoomed out moment to say, right, if I keep an eye on what that goal is, how do I have to think about this differently? How do I design this system differently to get there? So it's complex, but that's the fun part. And I'm sure, Abe, through your, the teams of folks within the ASCM, they're the ones who are going to solve this, not people like myself or from the foundation. It's going to be the experts, who sit within the supply chain, who can see where the quick wins are, but fundamentally, how do they turn this on its head and say, right, if this is the outcome we want now, we can't do the same thing with the same system and expect a different outcome. We need a different process to generate a different outcome.
A really interesting point that you're making here about supply chain and role responsibility. Obviously, circularity has to be embedded in every part of the organization. It's tough to cut it out of a particular area. Supply chain, for a number of years, we had anticipated that organizations would recognize the role and responsibility of a chief supply chain officer or a global supply chain officer to lead the endeavor in an organization. From your perspective, is it the CSCO or is it a chief sustainability officer or chief climate change officer? Where does this primary, at the highest level in the organization, if you had your druthers, where would that lie in terms of role responsibility in an organization?
Yeah, it is tough, right? You see organizations that have 1-2 person CSR teams. And they expect those 2 people, those 3 people to create and implement a strategy that changes the entirety of the organization. You see other organizations that don't have a CSR team because this is about all elements of the business: design, procurement, manufacture, supply chain, marketing, sales, legal, finance, everything. And actually, they take that approach. We don't want one department because actually all of us need to be thinking that way. And of course, it takes a while to shift from one end of that spectrum to the other. For me, you have to have something at the board level. You have to have the mandate and the agenda. And I would argue, going back to one of your previous questions, this idea of circular economy and how we set up better for the future, whether that's build back better, whether it is building resilience, this sits on the agenda of most boards now. It might not be in item number 1 or item number 2, but it's on the agenda. And you need that because you need a mandate to operate. You need to know that when you go to make those hard decisions, you have the backing of senior management. But then you also need it across the middle echelons of your organization. The project managers, the decision makers, the people who actually make these things happen. They need to understand why it's important and how they can dig into that. And then finally, the guys and girls on the shop floor, again, they need to know why this is important. So that means that whilst the message should be the same, the way you deliver it should be different, whether you're talking to the CFO, whether you're talking to your CSO, whether you're talking to your shop floor manager. And sometimes it's about education, and sometimes it's just about the articulation of it. What are the actual words we're using? So I think it is really great to see. And I think this was something that GreenBiz threw out during Circularity 19, that they had something like 900 people in the audience. And 80% of those people had circular economy or circular and sustainable economy within their job title. And that was a huge step change. I mean, it's quite a small pool, okay, but as a group of professionals across multiple industries, that's a big step change. If we've been fortunate enough to get to, the physical version of Circularity 20 this year, hopefully we would have seen a step change even further. So I think it's all those levels and more. There's also the consumer component. There's also the legislative component. Again, that's the beauty of diving into system level change. It's complex and you need to understand all of those complexities.
As the synchronization necessary, and as you're describing this, one of the things that comes to mind to me is the output, the data. How do you get around the concept of a destination versus a journey type activity for a lot of the data that's being developed right now? Because oftentimes within supply chain or finance, we look for that finite number. Tell me the target. And this is not as easily defined as a target, because as we learn more, we're also adapting and adopting different methodologies and different metrics associated with it. So what's the data been able to tell you so far?
It's so important. I don't need to tell anyone that. Everyone knows that data is important. You can't make informed decisions unless you know exactly what's happening, and whether that's in supply chain or any walk of life. I think one of the biggest challenges, maybe again, less so now, but over the last 12 months, traditionally, as this economy has operated, this global economy has operated over the last 200-300 years, couple of industrial revolutions, it's been about quarter on quarter, month on month growth, week on week growth. How have we done better today than we did yesterday? And when we start to look at some of these considerations now, you can't tell the difference between Monday and Friday or Monday in the next month, and six. There has to be a different way of viewing these metrics, or a different time horizon to viewing these metrics. The finance one is really important, and I don't think I don't need to tell you about that, but we've started working within for about 18 months now, most actively with the likes of BlackRock and Intesa Sanpaolo and a number of others, around what role does finance play in this transition to circular economy. And again, anecdotally, I remember watching a chap called Ed Fishwick, who's the managing director of Risk and Quant for BlackRock, on stage in 2018. And at that point, and I've told this story lots of times, so apologies if someone's heard it before. In 2018, he said, at that point, BlackRock had $6.3 trillion worth of assets under management. About $1.25 trillion of that were in green, circular, or ESG vehicles. And his point was, don't for a moment think that's us, BlackRock, telling our clients. It's our clients telling us that's where they want their portfolios. So that's 2018. Fast forward 18 months, 2 years, that shift has continued. And it's continued much quicker than we've seen in other industries. To the point whereby BlackRock in October 2019 set up a circular economy fund, a pretty modest fund at $20 million, right? I think, we were working with them, and I think there was an element of, okay, we'll have a punt. We'll see where this goes. Fast forward 12 months to October this year, that's now worth $900 million. It is the fastest growing vehicle that BlackRock have ever had. To the point we had Larry Fink, the CEO, a few weeks ago, saying exactly that in an interview with our CEO, Andrew Morley. So going back to your point about data, when you can point to tangible changes, tangible value of those magnitudes from 20 to 900 million, it starts to make the discussion about whether this is the right thing to do a lot easier to challenge. Ultimately, this has to make economic sense. Mm-hmm. You have to work with the system that we have, and you have to drive those levers to see the change you want. But it's got to make economic sense, because if it doesn't work in the long term. The great thing is you get the business model right, and you get all of these other amazing unintended social and environmental consequences, positive consequences. But you've got to get the business model right in the first place.
No, I couldn't agree with you more. As we start to become much clearer in terms of outputs and sort of drivers of change, finance is always among the first that organizations take a look at. If you're not financially sustainable, it's very hard to talk about long-term sustainable investments if you can't afford, your quarter to quarter. I'm going to shift a little bit. Give me a sense of public, private, government. What are the roles and responsibilities that you see between, the public role? What is the private enterprise role? And does government have a role here? Because we've seen whether we're in or out of the Paris, climate accords, are we following the UN, climate change? Are we, collectively, we're seeing different decisions by governments that have impact on private enterprise. Give me a sense of role responsibilities for circular economy and Circulytics.
Short answer is yes, all of those things. And I'm, being cognizant of the kind of North American demographic from an ASM perspective, and the fact that I'm also a Brit, stood in the UK with a European slant on what circular economy is. So I want to paint a contrasting picture to try and highlight why this is important. All of those areas are, whether it's legislative frameworks, supporting conditions that allow new circular economy business models to grow, whether it's businesses recognizing the opportunity to drive change as the front runners, or whether it is the consumer or a particular section of that economic value chain saying, no, this is the direction we're going. All of those are important. All of those levers need to be pulled at different times with different velocity. If you take Europe just for a moment, and the European Commission's Green New Deal and the circular economy framework that followed out of that. And we worked very closely with Franz Timmermans' office and his team around getting the framework and the language around circular economy correct. But business in Europe has been asking for that legislation for years. So here, this legislation is providing a supportive role to what business wanted. It's not carrot necessarily or stick. It's kind of a blend of both. It's an enabler. Cross over the Atlantic to the US and North America, this agenda is being led by business. It is being driven by those organizations that are looking at their partners in other parts of the world or looking at other elements of their business in other parts of the world and saying, we need to get onto this quicker than they did in the beginning, because this change is coming. This is now a trend that's here to stay. And we can't necessarily rely on that legislative framework to provide us the direction of travel. So we need to come together. And then you've also got the cities, the governments, the municipalities. These guys are driving the agenda amazingly as well. There's a huge amount of activity in North America and the US specifically that is based around cities that have large corporate organizations in their ecosystems, that have people that want to see change, that have the governors or the mayor's offices that are looking to drive change. And actually coming together and sitting around the table and saying, right, well, here's the engine of our economy and business. Here is the legislation providers and the construction that we can create through the mayor's office. Here's how we teach people using the universities. Here's our emerging innovators, the disruptors, the technology that we want to see. And actually, here's what our population are asking for. And we have the power to change the way that smaller system operates. So it's a bit of everything. You take a step then towards Southeast Asia and the APAC region. There's a slightly different flavor again between whether it's driven by business, policy, or a mixture of everything, or it is around, consumers. So I think it's about understanding what are the most impactful levers you can pull right now, and digging down on those, and then looking at what are the other elements that you need to pull in to find that new way of designing that new system.
Interesting. We talk about timing. You introduced the Circulytics right before the global pandemic really starts to become a decision point for every organization and almost every individual about the impact on their companies, on employees, on safety. How do we get around the immediacy of resiliency and agility and disruption and maintain that focus on that long-term sustainable environment and economy that we're trying to develop here? As you know, circular economies are not short-term initiatives, as you pointed out. We're looking at 3 to 5 years to get impactful data that can start to drive more, investments and change. What's next? How do we, is it, the disruption is going to get behind us at some point and then we can start talking about sustainability? My concern is that sustainability has taken a back seat to resilience, agility, and responsiveness in the current pandemic. How do we get sustainability back on, the page one of the agenda for boards, for management teams and alike? Yeah,
it's the conversations I've had over the last 9-10 months have fallen into two very discrete camps. Those folks who, when faced with the challenges that the pandemic has brought to their industry or their town or even closer to home, it's been about just keeping the lights on. We haven't, James, we can't worry about anything else at the moment because we don't know if we'll still be trading next week. And the second camp have been those that have still directly affected, but have kind of approached it from, actually, this will end. And we need to be prepared to come out of this and show leadership and head in a new direction. And that's a pretty simplistic way of summing up kind of multiple conversations over 12 months. But the thing that's really struck me, Abe, is that as we've moved through the pandemic, the amount of folks in bucket A has become less and less. And the amount of folks in bucket B is growing exponentially. There are always going to be winners and losers when you have something as deep cutting as a pandemic. And it's worth also pointing out, none of us really know the long-term effects and impact. We're crossing our fingers on vaccines. We're crossing our fingers on being able to get back to normal, on life opening up in general. But none of us really know for sure. So for me, when you're looking at trying to create a system that works in the long term, you have to be very mindful of these moments that we've had with the pandemic right now. But keep in mind that also doing nothing doesn't lead to a better outcome. So it's about trying to understand, how do you maximize the wins that you're feeling right at that moment, or, whether it's relevant or not. And then when you can kind of challenge and tackle that, is then getting out ahead of it and building your strategy and building again. There's a few kind of sound bites, I guess. Everyone's been talking about opportunity to build back better and stuff. I had a really great reframing of that by a chap called Chris Rayburn, who's a fashion designer here in the UK. And he said, this isn't about opportunity, it's about obligation. And we need to start reframing as obligation, because if we don't do anything, these things will perpetuate. Whether you believe all the science or not, there are some very stark, tangible impacts happening to our global supply chains, to our flow of commerce, to the way we live our daily lives than there were 10, 15, 20, 50 years ago. And the science tells us that that's going to accelerate even faster, whether that's biodiversity degradation, whether it's CO2, global warming, greenhouse gas emissions, staying below 1.5 degrees, all of these things. We need to start doing things differently. In the 1970s, the average age of a company across the UK was 67 years. In 2016, the average age of a company was 12 years. Mm-hmm. Now, again, it's a very big simplification, but you have to innovate or die. You have to remain agile, or as agile as you can. And that means tapping into all of these little bits that are coming up, whether it's coming from your suppliers, whether it's coming from legislation, whether it's coming from your consumers and your customers and your clients, or actually whether it's coming even close to home. I'm always amazed when I, get to chat to kind of senior folks and CEOs and stuff, how many times their 12 or 13-year-old child has said to them, you run this massive company that's responsible for some proportion of the challenge we're seeing now. What are you going to do differently about it? Abe, that makes my job so much easier, but there's something in that, right? Like, this problem is not going to go away. It's not. It may look different. It may feel different. Technology might pull us out of this. But fundamentally, we have to start redesigning the way our economies work so that they work for the long term, and they work for everyone. We've got roughly about 7 and a bit billion people on the planet. By 2050, that's going to be 10 billion. 80% of us are going to live in cities and mega cities. Most of the challenge we see today is from the kind of growth in middle classes and consumption over the last 10 or so years. There is a huge African and Chinese middle class population that is going to continue to boom and want to consume in the same way that maybe we've consumed over the last couple of decades. This problem is only going to get worse. And the only way we solve it is by fundamentally redesigning and rethinking our relationship with the way we make, produce, and circulate the materials that we have in our economy.
James, I can't thank you enough. Supply chain has benefited from the focus on circularity and sustainability. And I think our responsibility, as you're pointing out, to a global environment, I think really should be at the forefront of boards, of management, of consumers and patients alike. And I can't thank you enough for sharing your insights. And we look forward to continuing the conversation, and more importantly, getting the information out to individuals and having that dialogue and moving that conversation forward. Thank you very much, James.
It's been my pleasure. I mean, I'm not a supply chain specialist. It's easy for me to stand on my soapbox. And I've got a good friend of mine who, she quite often says, circular economy is inventory. If you know where the material is and it all flows in circles, we're in a circular economy. That again is a bit of a simplification, but maybe if we start thinking in supply loops rather than chains, maybe we treat things as at the molecular level. So someone like Rio Tinto is the inventory holder of molecules of carbon copper. But actually, when that gets turned into a product, then that particular manufacturer is then the owner of that. So I think it's about taking a fresh approach. The good news is, there are so many smart people out there within the supply chain ecosystem that they'll find a way. It's just making sure the direction of travel we're all heading in the right direction. And the best way to do that is work out where you are now and then where you want to get to.
Thank you very much, James. All the best to you. Stay safe and healthy, and look forward to continuing the conversation.
Thanks very much, Abe. Great. Thanks very much for having me.